Well, the money that the United States has spent trying to overthrow the Cuban government has been money down the rat hole. And the proof of it is that the Cuban government is still in place, and all that money has been expended to no good end. The democracy programs that USAID runs are essentially covert political action programs. They're the kind of thing that the Central Intelligence Agency used to do before the Reagan administration. It is not in the mission, if you will, of USAID. In every other country in the world, USAID works with the host government in designing and delivering programs aimed at improving development in that country. So the programs that are targeting Cuba are really unique in that regard. And they really haven't been effective. I think the studies that have been done by the General Accounting Office of the U.S. government have shown that a lot of this money has been wasted. And
from a Cuban point of view, the democracy programs are just another manifestation of a long line of kind of interventionist approaches to the Cuban Revolution. And you know, from the U.S. side, we have interests in democracies around the world, and we are going to be promoting democratic institutions and civil agencies and the rights of the individual. But the question for the United States is A, how to do it legitimately, and B, how to do it effectively. And the Cuban case has proved year after year after year that we are not doing this legitimately, and we're not doing it effectively. And it's been one of the great boondoggles, this over $200 million spent on these programs as mandated by Congress, in which very little has been accomplished on the ground, and arguably relations have been poisoned by the continuing effort to basically take a program that is supposed to be above board and overt and transform it into a surreptitious, semi-covert operation with people who are really not trained, supervised, and backed to undertake these kinds of operations.
I think that the case of poor Mr. Alan Gross really epitomizes so much of what's ill-conceived at the operational level, naive about that part of American policy. We have the Helms-Burton Law, which, just reading the text, basically calls for changing the government in Cuba. And it authorizes money to be spent to help people in Cuba to that end. It's an easy program to sell on Capitol Hill because those words sell well on Capitol Hill. And the administration goes, and we're doing this for the opposition, and they get their appropriations for it. It's a little hard to figure out how that's supposed to work in Cuba. And of course, the way it works in Cuba is that none of these programs can operate openly. The people who operate the programs are not trained covert operatives. They're usually just regular people, regular NGOs who, in this one country where they operate, have to operate in a semi-clandestine way. I say semi because they try to be completely clandestine in Cuba. But here, it's a public fact that the program operates, that the grants flow, that the money is provided. And so it doesn't make any sense. Operationally, it makes no sense at all, even if you love the purposes of it. Even if you love the idea of spending all that money, I don't think it's possible to explain logically how it's all supposed to work at the operational level. It's kind of naive in that sense, in its fundamental conception. And then, of course, Mr. Gross, I think, was a little bit naive to think that he could do what he was doing as if he was, you know, in Hartford, Connecticut instead of Havana, Cuba. It's one thing to bring books, it's one thing for visitors to go and talk with activists in Cuba, but he was doing something that was extremely sensitive, which was that he was one of a number of grantees that were setting up satellite internet, little nodes where there were, in his case, Jewish synagogues. And he apparently had plans to go beyond the Jewish synagogues in a later phase of his program. But to set up these satellite internet nodes where, in that case, the synagogue would have independent satellite access to the internet for email and everything else. And then it was also a Wi-Fi hotspot. And so, you know, one can only imagine how Cuban state security viewed that.
Alan Gross is sitting in a Cuban prison because of our USAID-funded democracy promotion program in Cuba. I think it's very important to stop and understand why. The USAID democracy promotion programs in Cuba are illegal. These programs are not done the way we do them in so many other countries, in cooperation and with the agreement and approval of the host government. You know, the objective of these programs is essentially to replace the existing government. It's regime change. The USAID money that is being handed out to DAI, Creative Associates, the Beltway bandits, who know very little about Cuba, who, like Alan Gross, may find themselves implementing what sounds great on paper, but are destined to fail in Cuba. More than anything is there's a lack of trust between our two governments. Big things just can't happen at this moment because we don't trust each other. Now, that being said, there are some good and positive and important things happening around the edges. And I credit both President Obama and, frankly, President Raul Castro for making those things possible. President Obama opened up travel for all Cuban Americans to go back and forth freely, to bring things, remittances to their families on the island, help support small businesses on the island. This is having a tremendous impact on Cuba. It is helping to open things up in Cuba. Now, on the other hand, Raul Castro has done things that have helped open up from that side. He has opened up travel for all Cubans. This is a door opening to the future. And I think that, that brings me back to what our view is of how you bring about positive change anywhere. And that is you let people talk to each other. You have as much human interaction as possible. You let people who disagree sit down together in a respectful way and talk about their differences. And by opening up travel, by ending the U.S. ban on travel by Americans to Cuba, we would be contributing to that. The word to remember with Cuba is engagement, engagement, engagement. That is the way forward. And I don't mean sneaky, covert, backdoor engagement. I mean, get on an airplane and fly there.
Levantarle el embargo al régimen de los Castro ahora mismo representaría para el régimen el arroparlo con legitimación, con reconocimiento de parte del gobierno americano, pero además esto se traduciría en créditos bancarios, en ayudas económicas financieras, en transferencia de tecnología, y la utilización que haría el régimen de todos estos aspectos es para sostenerse, para poder afianzar aún más los mecanismos represivos de los que vive, y para nada esto ayudaría al pueblo cubano, al contrario, consolidaría mucho más la permanencia del régimen castrista.
Well, I don't think anybody who thinks we need a change in U.S. policy towards Cuba is against democracy in Cuba. I think the criticism of the current policy is it's been trying to bring about democracy in Cuba for 50 years and hasn't worked. So it's time, as the president said early on, time to try something different.
USAID is very tricky to work with. While they have hundreds of transparency programs for other countries, they're very opaque themselves. I've been looking into USAID programs for a long time. USAID has always been a part of my interest. I thought as a taxpayer, I should be able to know where my money was going, especially if it was a civilian issue. This has nothing to do with national defense. And USAID decided that I did not have the right to know who they were funding.
I mean, there just is so little transparency. There is so little public information about what they're actually doing with this $20 million. I don't think that the U.S. government should be in the business of doing any kind of program. I mean, this is not covert. This is not the CIA. This is supposed to be something that we all know about and support, and yet you cannot get information about it. And I find that deeply troubling.
So I'm not pretending that if Americans travel freely to Cuba, if American companies are free to invest in Cuba, that suddenly the Cubans are going to be adopting the U.S. model. I mean, far from it. But I think it's to the better if we're there, and I think it's to the better if we have contact. They're neighbors, after all. There are great historical ties, and there are great cultural ties, sports, jazz, all other kinds of music, science, not to mention trade and economic relationships that should be rebuilt.
I don't think anybody really sees Cuba as a threat to the United States. I don't think that the Cold War mentality is really meaningful to anyone anymore, and it shouldn't be. And I think that we have to just get over the fact that we may not like things that are happening on that island. We may not like their form of government. We may not like the Castro family, but we just have to get over it, and we have to engage with them for our own self-interest as well as that of the Cuban people.